All right, it's all you, Melissa.
Great, thanks, Christine, and hello, everybody. It's really great to see lots of new people here and also lots of friends and colleagues. Welcome. And we anticipate people from a couple different continents, so I'll say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're pleased for you to be here, and thanks for sharing your time with us. I'm Melissa Cragin, Chief Strategist for Data Initiatives at the San Diego Supercomputer Center at the University of California, San Diego. We have lots to share with you today. I often am guilty of producing too many slides, so I'll do my best and we'll get started. I'll also say some slides are informational. We won't spend a lot of time on them, but the slide deck will be available, and we'll post that up shortly after the webinar. There are lots of resources embedded as well. So I'm joined today by my colleagues on the GOFIR US team, Christine Kirkpatrick, who leads this effort, Chris Erdman, Julianne Schneider, Nancy Hobel-Heinrich, and our new coordinator, Alex Andreu, who helps us maintain our momentum and for which we are most grateful, particularly me. She helps me stay on task so we get things out on time. Okay, so FAIR is a distributed ecosystem. It's a means to an end. And as our colleague Albert Mons says, the goal of FAIR data is that both people and machines can use the data more efficiently, but mainly for machines to do this. This can be data from different systems within or between organizations or even across industries. The end result of going FAIR is that data can talk to each other. It's optimized for analytics and reuse and increases the value of implicit knowledge. Here are the principles as they were written out and just put in a box. They weren't described in depth, but in the original publication led by Mark Wilkinson in 2016. And we won't spend any time really doing a deep dive on the principles themselves today. But we really wanted to just remind everyone what they are and spend a little time talking about context. So Mark said in 2019 publication that FAIR is non-trivial. It's often domain specific at anything other than the most superficial level. So, you know, as we think about where we've made real gains across the world in terms of FAIR, developing in technologies and organizational approaches. Really, we've been focused on the findable and the findable and accessible. And when we get to the interoperable and reusable, this is where we have real challenges with figuring out what we do to implement this. So let's consider here FAIR as a continuum, made easier when we consider at the resource level and how to make these things more fair. We must work in concert with science and humanities communities as they are the real experts with the data that they produce and consume. This slide is borrowed from Carol Gable in a talk she gave last January as part of the FAIR's FAIR organization. And she proposes FAIR as an aim, really, that the principles are inspirational. They present us with a spectrum of farification and how we consider going more fair. They are domain respectful, so we want to make sure that we're engaged with domain communities when we're considering the ways that we talk about and implement the FAIR principles. And I want to say also, importantly, that the FAIR principles provide a framework for promoting and prompting organizational change. And we'll get to that again as one of the pillars of GOFIR in a few moments. Most importantly, Carol spent a lot of time thinking about what the FAIR principles are not. And here, I think these are all important, that we've spent a lot of time thinking about what FAIR is and how, as information professionals, we want to go about organizing and helping develop FAIR skills and do training about FAIR and where it fits in the broader open access and open science arena. Importantly, though, I think we have to remind ourselves, as well as when we do training about FAIR, that it's not a standard. There isn't a perfect end result for the FAIR principles. That moving toward FAIRification and resources and our practices being more fair, it's all about a growth process and changes in practice and culture. And I'll leave this here, but it's a great talk. If you're interested, the link is here, or I'll make the link available. But Carol provided a really wonderful talk about FAIR history and future at the FAIR's Fair event last winter. So moving now to the GOFIR Initiative and what it is. GOFIR, the GOFIR International Support and Coordination Office, was launched a couple of years ago. The GOFIR Foundation was started in 2018. And the aim of this initiative is to support and foster a global, collaborative, committed group of volunteers to build out components of the Internet of FAIR data and services. The GOFIR initiative is organized and mobilizes around 3 pillars. Go Change, which is focused on priorities, policies, and incentives for implementing FAIR. This is about sociocultural change and practice involving relevant stakeholders at all levels relevant for flourishing of open science. Go Train and coordinating is about coordinating FAIR awareness and skills development, and actually delivery of training modules. Training required to really move toward data stewards capable of designing and implementing proper data management plans and developing and verifying data and data resources across the global internet. Go Build is about coordinating FAIR technologies, designing and building the technical standards, best practice, and infrastructure components needed to implement the FAIR data principles. We'll turn to some of these technologies in a few moments and think about some of the early developments that are helping to develop the FAIRification of resources, particularly organized for the European Open Science Cloud, but with a global perspective. And this is where the US GOFIR office is interested to think about these technologies that are being developed, the ways that are being implemented and rolled out for the EU and beyond, and how we can help adapt those for the US environment. So just a moment to think about data stewardship. I think for the US audience, this is really speaks to the ways that we think about stewardship here in the US anyway, and linked directly with the long-standing digital and data curation efforts here in the US. Data stewardship, I think, adds a layer here. So thinking about adding value to data and other resources across the entire life cycle. Now, we do that in the curation perspective, but here there are some additional kinds of skills and technologies being applied. Both thinking about linking research data management practices and skills and training with planning for long-term use, and also the organizational policy aspects of that. In addition, it's the application of standards and semantic technologies. So really adding value directly into the exposed metadata and data resources that are become part of the internet of FAIR data services and tools. Adding value to the support of new kinds of use. And so those kinds of things are thinking about how to work with communities directly to link data management plans, to link open science kinds of approaches into the new resource spectrum that's being developed through FAIR data tools. And then training for these new roles and added skills. The data stewardship approach in the EU is really focused on new kinds of skills and new roles across the academic and research institutions in the EU. I think there's some real interest here in the US and I think we'll see some real uptake for some of these new skills here as well. So moving to the technologies, GOFIR, the GOFIR organization, is working on these really sort of flying the plane as it goes, right? Building the plane as it goes, the design as we go approach. They've adopted a 3-point verification framework: metadata for machines, the FAIR implementation profile, and the FAIR data point. We'll talk about each of these at a couple different points as we go along. But really, they're thinking about this in the perspective of convergence on standards, so that we're not developing new standards constantly across the world and across different domains. We can help leverage and utilize standards that exist, or identify gaps where we need to develop new standards that can be shared more generally. And around community-driven choices for how to exchange metadata and data, and to facilitate new science that leverages what machines can do best to analyze very large and distributed data sets that will uncover new patterns, illuminate anomalies, and generate new hypotheses. The metadata for machines workshops and the approach for this really is to assist domain experts, whether working at a particular community of practice, so around particular problems, or for groups that are actually working together, different kinds of groups working together that need to bring different data types together to solve both industry, administrative, organizational, and science problems. So these workshops assist domain experts, whether they're administrative, management, or science experts, who want to produce FAIR resources by creating machine actionable metadata services that will adhere to the FAIR principles. So you can see this here. The way that this works is it's a 1 to 2 day set of workshops that create high priority machine actionable metadata for specific needs of that particular community. They focus on simple but extensible concept model, which can be RDF but does not have to be, that solve clearly identified FAIR related metadata goals for that organization, domain, or community. The workshops are generally hackathon type events that focus on particular sort of kickstart verification efforts. The meetings often produce recommendations on standards as well as templates that easily support the production of metadata from the start of a new research project of interest to that community of practice. The workshops are being run now, and not only are they sort of starting to solidify and harden the processes, and those processes are going to be able to be replicated across other groups, but new groups are starting to uptake the application of these processes of the 2-day workshops, and working on best practices for actually the production of this process. So Nancy will speak to the FAIR implementation profile and matrix technology shortly, so I'll simply introduce this now. The FAIR implementation profile is a collection of FAIR implementation choices made by a community of practice around each of the FAIR principles. Communities' specific implementation profiles are themselves captured as FAIR data sets and are made openly available for other communities to use. The matrix actually aligns a set of different implementation profiles where you can look for commonalities and opportunities to solve gaps or utilize existing approaches that may be happening in other disciplines or communities. FIPs are rigorous way to document attempts at FAIR implementation and can be objectively evaluated on its overall FAIR maturity level. Building a FIP does not imply 100% fairness. They are sort of a guided path on a journey toward FAIR. This is just a picture of a matrix. And what happens here, we'll put the link for this, but the links to an overall example of this FAIR implementation matrix is available freely on the web, and we'll post this later as well. FAIR data points are ultimately stores of information about data sets. They included definition, they include metadata and metadata about these data sets. And just like the web server in the World Wide Web, and I'm drawing this, this text now directly from the fairdatapoint.org website that really describe these as well as the reference implementation quite deeply. But just as the web server was developed in the early 1990s, brought power to publishing text, the FAIR Data Point aims to give people the power of putting data sets out onto the web. The system is called a FAIR Data Point because it takes care of a lot of issues needed to make the data fair, particularly being able to expose metadata needed for findability and reusability in a uniform and systematic way. FAIR Data Points also address interoperability of metadata, but interoperability of data itself is left to the data providers and communities. FAIR Data Points have three components. There's a defined API, and that's mostly based on DCAT, the data catalog standard from WW3. There's a reference implementation and now some new implementation models developing as well in the EU and being tested there across a number of projects. And there's a front-end API client. The fairdatapoint.org site is here, and that will link you to the GitHub site to be able to go in and look at that, and you can implement your own now. All the specs are there. Moving now to the organizational context around GOFIR and other existing data organizations, which some of which you'll all be familiar with right now. There's GOFIR launched together with RDA, CODATA, and the World Data System, a new collaboration called Data Together. Data Together was launched in the spring of 2020 by these four major international data organizations, and they've aligned to facilitate joint efforts, leverage expertise, resources, and increase reach across the communities. Their aim and focus areas are complementary, and we anticipate that over time, this cooperative arrangement will increase the pace and integration of FAIR into the research landscape. The launch of the US Coordination Office happened early in 2019 when Christine launched it there at SDSC in California. We held the first data stewardship training at SDSC in May of 2019, and then we started to grow the team. GOFIR advances capacity in the US. That's one of our primary aims. And we spend time now developing training activities, helping to facilitate the implementation of the growth of implementation networks in the US and build technical services. You can see the goals that are listed here. They're available on the website along with some others and give links to some of the actual activities that we're involved with. In February of this year, we went to Atlanta, Georgia to host this workshop. We partnered with the South Big Data Hub, and we led this Advancing FAIR workshop to help develop capacity in the US and help facilitate community of practice around the FAIR principles. Through this initial group, we're building this community. We've had a number of activities. People are engaged through our Slack channel and a Google Mail account. And we're beginning to do some trainings on some of these technologies that are rolling out across the EU and globally. We had broad participation across multiple institutions and research organizations with funding and participation from different US science agencies. We had industry partners as well and industry participants, and spent 3 solid days together really thinking about how to mobilize and develop FAIR capacity in the US and begin to translate implementation of FAIR at the institutional level particularly in the academic space here in the US. We're working on a short report now from this meeting, and we'll be distributing that a bit later. One of the outcomes, as I said, one of the outcomes of the workshop was to reinvigorate our office. And here's our team. I'm sorry, I don't have headshots here of folks, but the list here just, I think, really gives us a very broad view and gives you all a view of the kinds of expertise and connections that the team brings to help build this capacity in the US. We all have complementary skills. We're involved in very different ways with global efforts and at the national level with developing data policy and activities here in the US. And we're happy to be in touch with any of you at any time. Our contact information will be on the final slide. At the same time that we held that second workshop, the Advancing FAIR workshop in February, at that time, the COVID virus had already launched. And in the midst of delivering that workshop, in fact, was the solidification of this VODAN network, the Virus Outbreak Data Network, that really focused immediate international attention, of course, on the COVID virus, but the VODAN network was able to really quickly become an approach to implement these FAIR technologies, these GOFIR technologies, to foster data access and build knowledge networks amongst data and publication resources specific to addressing the COVID-19 virus. There's already been new understandings about the biomedical and clinical processes of the COVID disease because of the work here that was launched by Baron Mons and his colleagues. And here in the US, Christine put together a series of webinars related to the VODAN efforts. These are recorded and available from the website, and that slide with all those links will be available in the section upcoming. Christine has been instrumental in the collaboration with the VODAN-Africa group, and she'll say more about that now.
So within the VODAN Implementation Network, we have the project VODAN-Africa, and this is funded in part by the Phillips Foundation and chaired by Mohammed Mpeza Mahigo and Francisca Oladipo, who's the executive coordinator. Both are from Kampala International University in Uganda. And then, of course, Miriam Van Rysen from Leiden University is another founder of this. It's working on 3 very complementary projects related to capacity building for FAIR in the US. The first is the need to train up the data stewardship workforce, which from the chat you can see is a huge interest for all of us. The materials and the way of organizing the network of data stewards can be directly applied back here in the US. Second is the focus on metadata for machines that you heard a bit about. This is part of the skill building for the data stewards. Through a series of workshops, they are able to find gaps in metadata practices and build things from the ground up if needed. This culminates in the use of FAIR data points, another point of convergence for people who work in GOFIR. So rather than use the old model of trying to collect all the data into a data lake or something, the idea is that you publish the data so it can be visited, even if it's just metadata about the data that resides there. It's through these 3 efforts that VODAN-Africa is working to create data stewardship capacity along with infrastructure that can be used for this pandemic and for future challenges. And if you want to see an example of a working FDP, there's a tiny link there on the left. It's from the University de Sousse in Tunisia. This is the piece of the ecosystem of FAIR data and tools that's really not meant for humans, right? But this helps us to go out and see how it works. This is really so that computers can find and make use of the data. The data on this FDP relates to verifying vulnerable populations. And if you missed that session at last week's FAIR Convergence workshop, I recommended, I'm a little biased, I moderated it. But if you want to hear the latest about what's going on with VODAN-Africa and specifically for vulnerable populations across Africa, it was really informative. Next slide, please. We are an active member of VODAN and VODAN-Africa for the reasons mentioned by Melissa and on the last slide. She already mentioned our 4-part series on COVID in partnership with GOFIR, and then also the 3-part series on VODAN-Africa, which is all still there and all very relevant. The same issues are being worked through, but it reminded us of some other things. At some point, we all stopped optimizing our graphics and videos, and that is still incredibly needed across Africa, and actually needed by many populations here in the US. And there's a lot of other data that is useful to put on these FDPs along with COVID data, especially related to social data and economics. Back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Christine. The team is engaged with a number of other training events through other platforms, resources, and activities by other organizations. We're deeply involved in this, both with training and dissemination of FAIR resource materials. And as an example, as part of the Force 11 Scholarly Communication Institute from this past summer, members of our GOFIR US team participated in 2 of the 4 FAIR-related training sessions. I note that materials from the FISCI 2020 summer event, those materials will be made publicly available quite soon. All of the training materials are being moved over to an open platform over these couple of weeks. As I noted, members of our team led 2 of these. The FAIR Data and Scholarly Communications Lifecycle, which Chris will speak to in a few moments, and the Advancing FAIR Data Stewardship training on fostering institutional planning, which Christine and I led with Natalie Myers from University of Notre Dame. I know there was significant interest in FAIR this year, which is why FISCI had 4 different events as part of the Institute this year. You know, and the interest in FAIR across the information professionals around the globe that participated at FISCI really were interested in understanding for themselves, but also their organizations, you know, what does this mean for us? How do we understand what FAIR means in how we describe it, how it fits with research data management and curation services, what's its role in terms of open science, how do we teach about it, and how do we implement FAIR tools and services? So we spent in our workshop on advancing FAIR, we talked a lot about the context of FAIR in a global environment, a global open science and research environment. But we also spent a significant amount of time talking about and thinking about how to consider developing a data stewardship plan or policy for organizations and institutes. And so we thought about this at the local level, and as part of this work, Christine and Natalie and I developed this tool. Christine really organized this, and then we spent some time tweaking it. But this tool is now available. It'll be posted up through Zenodo quite soon. It'll be public through the OSF platform shortly as well. But this tool is now, this template is now available for a planning process. And it was used to consider for planning service development at those levels. A form can be used in many ways by individuals or teams. It can be used in a single setting or developed across time. And the aim is to consider in that local context around the digital assets and the current policies within an organization, opportunities for culture change and approaches for improving trends toward being more fair. And now I'll turn it over to Nancy Hobel-Heinrich, who's going to present on FIP and Matrix training session from another conference, the Earth Science Information Partners, or ESIP Summer Meeting.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we did with the, it was a working session at ESIP Summer 2020, so July of last year, and it We were doing this a little ahead of the game in terms of what was happening in Europe with the machine for the M4M workshops and the FIP work over there to some extent. So it was interesting to do this workshop and then see what's happened since then. But our main goal was to really see whether we could work with the ESIP community to move toward a fair data ecosystem, really think of it from an ecosystem point of view. The people in the ESIP community has been talking and thinking about FAIR for a while, but it had always been, from my observation, it had always been more at the kind of abstract level of, again, as Melissa mentioned, the focus upon findability and accessibility rather than the more difficult interoperability and reusability principles. So one of our motivations, and Melissa was part of this as well as Christine and Natalie Myers again, and another woman from Georgia, Alabama's government, Denise Hills. What we were intending to do was really to see if we could explore what the community knew about implementing the fair data principles rather than just at that kind of abstract level. And also then introduce the tools, some of which that Melissa mentioned, for actually working towards implementing FAIR principles, especially in terms of documenting the agreements that people either knew they had already tacitly agreed within their own community, or needed to find out that they needed to work on. So those tools were the FAIR convergence matrix that Melissa mentioned already, the FIPS, the FAIR implementation profiles. But we did it using a tool that had been developed through the GOFIR Initiative called the Data Stewardship Wizard, with a specific instance of it for FIPS. So the FIP Wizard, I've got the link there if you're interested in looking at that, because they had set up a knowledge model by which people could fill out the questionnaire regarding the issues that they as a community would need to address related to implementing the FAIR data principles. So it's interesting to go look at that wizard and see who's created FIPS, and they have an option of making them public or shareable, or just public if they're in draft form. So it's interesting to see who's been doing that and what they've been doing. But one of the takeaways from the workshops itself, or the sessions themselves, of which there were two. The first one was 90 minutes essentially talking about what FAIR was to a certain extent, but exploring through small groups, in the breakout sessions with Zoom, what people knew about each of those principles with moderators to kind of keep things moving along. And then the second session was offering the opportunity to work with people who wanted to create their own FIPS. So we didn't, naturally, there wasn't time to finish the FIPS themselves often unless people had a pretty good idea of what their agreements were. But everyone did, the takeaways were that people really saw the value of understanding and knowing what others have done in terms of implementing FAIR, and they really wanted to know more about machine actionable metadata. So that might argue well for having us do a machine for metadata workshops over here. Possibly if people are interested in doing that, can see how that works. But then people did see that the GOFIR tools and services could be very helpful to ESIP, the ESIP community, in implementing FAIR, and that the partners, the people who are part of the geoscience community and geospatial community, should really be contributing more to the GOFIR tools, but also to their service for sharing standards and so on, the fairsharing.org directory that is available, and then really work to create more FAIR implementation profiles. So we're not sure quite where to go with that yet. It'll be interesting to work with the GOFIR team on this and really see what we can move forward with, both within ESIP, but also in the broader community too. So I think Chris is next. Is that right? On to Chris.
I think so.
On to Chris.
Yeah.
Next slide. Yeah. All right. Am I sharing? Oh no. Okay.
Nope, got it.
All right. So yeah, this was this is sort of leading up to the FAIR the FAIR session that we had at FAIR at the FISCI event that we're speaking of right now. So to start off with this FAIR lesson that may have been mentioned in the chat earlier has been sort of this community effort that it started in the carpentries, but other people outside the carpentries really have been contributing to it as well. And so the idea behind it is that we have sort of this introductory FAIR lesson that could be taught by really anyone. You know, there was a question in the chat about, you know, is there something librarians can teach to researchers, you know, or, you know, if you're running a research hub or some sort, is there a general lesson that you can teach? And this is the aim of this lesson, is to be more of a general introductory lesson. And we've had conversations with the metadata for machines group, you know, members of that group, about this being more like a component or an intro to that, even, you know, something that can, you know, get people started, because they've said, you know, we really still need something that's sort of basic, that helps people get, you know, get on the way to the point of delving deeper. And so that, you know, this has been sort of a collaborative effort. And next slide. That's the lesson. It's developed on GitHub, you know, we're going to have a follow-up sprint. We had a recent sprint, it feels like not too long ago in these pandemic times, but I think it was in August, and we have some follow-up items that we'll hopefully work on over the holiday season, over December and January. And the idea is that this is not just a carpentry thing, but it gets moved to, you know, these wider audiences, like Research Data Alliance's possibility, and GOFIR is another. So it can be, you know, people can participate in those other arenas, or just more broadly, as sort of this common general lesson. And if anyone is interested in helping with that, let me know. That would be great. We're still in the process of developing it, and hoping to get to that sort of version 1. I think we'll always be at the starting line because this will be something that iterates over time. You know, there's always things changing, but the goal is to get to that starting line of you know, some place where everyone can sort of start from and reuse. But this really sort of led to the next slide, which is this Scholarly Institute, the life cycle session that we ran. Those are the people I worked with. So Daniel Banger and Fiona Murphy and Natasha Simons at Australian Research Data Commons. And it was pretty well received. It was also very much like an intro, get familiar with FAIR. And next slide. You know, really, I pulled out some of the extracted out some of the main points of that session. Those slides is that we really walk through the journey, all the different elements. You know, like there are different moving parts involved of becoming FAIR, and so it really you know, it's really more like a team approach of and also, you know, going back to again that journey, is that you know, really it's a step by step thing. You know, like you can't become FAIR overnight. You have to take these steps, iterative steps, to become more FAIR over time. And then next slide, we sort of extracted out these main recommendations, you know, which is what the funders could do to help assist with this, and the services, you know. So one example there is the ontology. So, you know, the funders can drive, help with driving this data sharing, the criteria that people can use to become more FAIR. And then the repositories can help with like establishing APIs and you know, doing more of the certification process to become more FAIR. And then institutions, the training element, I think, is what was brought up earlier, and I think a lot of us will grapple with is, yeah, you know, you can do all this other stuff, but there's this huge boulder that you have to push up a hill with, as far as, you know, getting the community on board, the training, the culture involved, and, you know, really building momentum and becoming more FAIR. So yeah, those were some of the key, you know, sort of items that came up in our FISCI course. On to the next slide, I guess.
So how can you get involved? So we'll start to wrap up now. We'll talk a little bit more, just wrap up with how to get involved and connect with us at GOFIR US. And then we have just a series of resource slides that we'll sort of move through quickly, so we have plenty of time for Q&A and some discussion. So the GOFIR US website, it's gofirus.org. And you can connect with us through any number of channels. In fact, our Slack channels are quite active. We do have a Twitter account and make announcements about our events and other fair-related events there in Twitter. And we've got a news and events page where we post up training activities and other kinds of things, including our upcoming webinars, which you can see in the red box. So there are links. There are links to the today's and also the previous webinar and the upcoming webinar in January, which is on research software. And we'd be happy to have you join us in any number of events or even get more deeply involved with some of the activities that we're producing. So you can learn more about what's happening with Data Together, as well as events being run by these different organizations connected to the GOFIR efforts. Here are some papers and other kinds of resources that are available. Again, we'll post the slides up really quickly after this meeting. They'll be linked off our website. And so these resources will all be available, and we'll continue to grow this list of recommendations for both reading and other sorts of materials that are available out in the wider world. Here are, so the first webinar series on VODAN that Christine put together when VODAN was launched very early in the spring. These are some really nice introductions to both GOFIR and some of the FAIR activities happening across the world, including in the US. So as some of you may know, there were activities immediately out of a number of academic institutions and also federal agencies funded rapid research projects quite early. And so some of these are presented here through a couple of these webinars. And then Christine already mentioned last week's International FAIR Convergence Symposium, which was put together by the GOFIR Coordination Office and also CODATA. It was a 4-day event. They ran almost 24 hours with some of the activities, but some really, really substantial webinars, both at some very sort of high level thinking about policy and community building, but also some really deep dives into the technologies being developed, including, for example, provenance tools being developed for FAIR environments, just as an example. And so some, again, highly technical sessions, but also other sessions that were much more introductory and really helping to spread skills and network people across the FAIR and open science environments. Let me also just mention, if you have some time and you're interested, the final plenary on Friday, this last Friday, which was December the 4th, that final plenary was about the COVID-19 environment and what's happening there, and all different kinds of presentations about that. And it was quite good, and I can recommend it if you're interested sort of in global responses to what's happening around COVID. So thank you. This is the last slide. Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes or a little bit more for Q&A, or we can stay on longer than that as needs be. We're open to any discussion or questions. I'm not following the chat, so please,
Melissa,
please
can I add one more
Please,
comment
Nancy.
about
Yeah,
the FAIR Convergence Matrix? Symposium. The thing that's, I would agree with Melissa that the last plenary was really helpful, but also the VODAN workshops are really helpful for really understanding how FAIR data points work and how, what the real advantage is to bringing this kind of data together with very concrete examples. And of course, you know, COVID is something that's really matters now, but it would be looking at those for yourselves, and then also providing those as opportunities for your researchers to really understand, you know, how those the FAIR data points could be used in their own environments is really useful. So I would really encourage people to look at that, and especially the VODAN workshop. I found the most useful was the people from UCSF. I think it was the third one, maybe. Christine.
Yes, that was the third one. Yep.
Yeah, that's an excellent one for just understanding, you know, how the data comes together and what needed to be done to do it. So I would recommend you look at those.
Thank you.
So I know with the Zoom webinar format, it's a little stodgy because you can't just turn on your camera and unmute yourself and ask a question. But there is the Q&A tool. Of course, keep using the chat if that works for you. You know how to find us, hopefully, on the Slack channel or in Twitter. It looks like we have a question from Brian. So I'll read it, and then hopefully my panelists, you can decide who wants to jump in. With NIH and NIEHS putting more emphasis on FAIR, I'm getting more questions regarding what does it mean for researchers and their data and our IR capacity.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you know, Brian, there have been also several meetings and now some report outs starting to happen in this space. And I'll just note that the APLU and AAU series, their funded project to think about this in a broad way, their final report will be out in the spring 2021. And I do anticipate that they will have recommendations. Those meetings, as you might recall, were the leadership, the administrative leadership for research across multiple campuses. And they'll be putting out recommendations, I think, in this space. But I think it's an interesting time for this. You raised the institutional repository issue. You know, a lot of institutions are prepared to take smaller data sets into their IRs, but a lot of institutions are not. In part, it could be that the platform they've used for their IR, it could be that they've developed a different repository for data, which is great, or they're joining some sort of consortial effort. And there are lots of mid to small universities that will not be able to host an institutional repository or a data repository. And so thinking about two approaches. One is that I do think we will need to see more consortial arrangements around institutional repositories. So big institutions that are able to lead efforts and open up their repository services to other institutions to be able to utilize those. I see that as a potential pathway. Not that that's happened in large part yet, but I see that as a potential. Perhaps there'll be, you know, regional kinds of repositories that open up that are multi-institution regional repositories. But also I think a place where we have knowns, and that is domain-based or community-based repositories, those will continue to grow. I think we'll see new ones. I think the hard part right now with those repositories and those community-led repositories is that over the last 2 years, they've seen an explosion of deposits without an increase in their funding or federal support. So this is a gap we have right now, particularly in the US. It's problematic. It's known across the research environment. And I think we'll start to see some changes in what this means for both funding and sustainability. But I know that there aren't public solutions to those things yet. I'll leave it there. I think Christine might have a thought.
Yeah, so I've got something loaded up to paste into the chat. So one of the ways that we think about these problems at, you know, a high abstract level, and then we also try out some of our ideas on specific projects. And one of the places that we're working with is the EarthCube Council of Data Facilities. And this is a group of domain repositories grappling with some of these very issues and making recommendations. I think another thing that we are going to have, so let me press enter. I really miss my 20s and 30s when I could do multiple things at once. Okay. I think something else that we're going to have to help researchers figure out is when people do small data and it's Excel spreadsheets and images and some things that fit into institutional repositories, great. But as we're seeing people trying to make AI fair and figuring out, you can't save all the inputs and the outputs in the simulations. And so figuring out what things need to get deposited into community places. For example, where are we going to put the models or the surrogates or the benchmarks and things that someone might not be looking for in an institutional repository, and where the importance is that it's stored with other things like it. And so I think there's a lot of guidance that needs to be developed by working through specific use cases with researchers. To that end, on an upcoming webinar, I hope to, Melissa and I will be ready to show you something that we in the team have just started work on. And that's another tool similar to the institutional assessment tool that, it's the journey is the reward. So it's a tool that would help you work through with a researcher how they would make their data, software, different artifacts of their project fair. And we've loaded in some simple questions that a researcher would know the answer to, but that would give you a chance to talk with them about the specifics where the blanks are. And especially with an eye towards some of these bleeding edge proposals that are going in for AI institutes and some of the HDR and Convergence Accelerator. And these are all NSF calls, where it can be really difficult to try and give someone advice for their DMP. So we really hope to reach out to all of you in the community so that we can load this up with the best knowledge out there and then leverage other things that exist already.
So this is Chris too. I'm on an NIH project. So since you mentioned NIH specifically, Brian, I think it's really interesting. I can give you sort of an idea of like how FAIR is being discussed. I think like it's still, yeah, it's like you say, it's very broad. It's still like in discussions like, let's make this more fair, like you say. And I think one of the things we're doing now is addressing that and building in sort of the assessment approach that you know others have talked about, but you also talked about too. And some of the items that I shared earlier in sort of the assessment component of the FAIR lesson, I drew into that part of how will we start addressing FAIR in this NIH project that we're working on. So we start ingesting data into, you know, the biodata catalyst, which is the project I'm on. You know, how do we, you know, how do we provide some sort of guidance, but also assessment approaches for people to understand how they can make their their data more fair per the ingestion process. So, you know, I think that like, I don't think I can share what we're doing right now, but I can say that a lot of the information that I drew upon is in that assessment module. You know, can be a starter as far as like how to sort of prepare people, and I think that's something at least that I'm looking at for the research triangle, University of North Carolina and other universities, is to do also sort of the assessment approach of like, you know, having sort of a series where people can start that process of sort of going down the list and ticking off like how do they think they are fair in you know, like how are they, how what makes sense to their community. And one of my favorite examples, and I think I might have shared this with in the FISCI course, I think I did too, but I think Zenodo has a very straightforward answer to how they respond as a repository to the FAIR principles. If you go down into the footer of their website, there's a principles link. And you know, it's very straightforward, and I've always shared that with people, and they've said this is clear. You know, it really helps you know, with understanding how a repository is thinking about applying FAIR. But yeah, I think, is there another follow-up question in the chat?
I pasted in the link into the chat that you were referencing, Chris. Well, let's see, we've got about 4 minutes to go. Did we want to give out a save the date for January? Or am I giving up the theater of the what's to come?
No, we should again. Yeah, the January, it was on one of the slides, so we can come back to it again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so January 14th. But we'll be posting in the Slack channel. If you are not there, if you can join, that would be great. And then, or we'll be posting to our Twitter account. But I will like to maybe summarize some things. Like, people in the chat earlier asked if we could give updates on some of these other efforts, right? The metadata workshops and the implementation profiles, and the I think the third part, the FAIR data points. Like, people were hoping for just an update. Maybe we can email with what we know of those communities, and how maybe people can get you know, maybe participate, or at least share information to their communities. And then there was another item about data stewardship, and maybe growing a community in the US. I don't think there's specifically something called the, you know, like the Europeans have data stewards groups. And that was a good point of, you know, fostering something like that as well. And if that we want to continue the conversation, we could do that in our Slack channel, or also via email is another way. But
Okay, so I'm just going to follow up really quickly. So Chris, I'm picking up on what you said. I see Heidi asked about, you know, what's happening, what sort of, how does the post M4M process work, and sort of extending to more disciplinary community. So yeah, Heidi, that's the right question. And really to sort of follow up on what I was attempting to say earlier. So the M4M workshops are still in the process for them, are in fact not only still hardening in terms of how that process is documenting. There's actually a set of handbooks being developed now on the 3-point verification process, the 3-point framework, and M4M. I'm actually working with a couple of people on the M4M handbook. I think those are the lessons learned for how all that's been functioning will be out. Eric Schultes, who's been leading a lot of these efforts, is actually writing this month on the lessons learned from these things. So that will be published fairly soon. But to get at your specific question, so my experience with these M4M workshops is that they have been, frankly, when you hear the term discipline or domain with M4M, they're actually not at that level. And this has been something that I've been working on with Eric. In fact, the M4M workshops have been very focused on very specific teams of people and problems in what they call that a project there. So for example, there was just a series of M4M workshops in the VODAN space that was conducted by a set of teams in the EU and predominantly the Netherlands. And just to wrap up, they were focused very much on very specific teams. There was one for management. There was one on identifying COVID symptoms. There was one on on testing solutions and clinical outcomes. I mean, so they were very focused on specific problem areas so that they could set up the metadata required to expose, the information being managed by these different teams in the context of a particular problem space. There is not an expectation, I think. Certainly, these things can be used and adopted by others, but they are being designed, the exact MFRM workshops are to design implementation, the forms for specific teams of people and projects. So let me just say that, and I think there'll be more on how we actually start to scale out or disseminate this and be able to translate some of that to other groups later on. And certainly that's what once this is all done, a fair implementation profile can be generated, and that's where we begin to be able to translate across communities or discipline areas.
Heidi says thanks. That was a good description overview.
And we are at the top of the hour and people are needing to bail off and get to their next Zoom. Melissa, I'll let you close, and let me just say I did put a corrected registration link in the chat. Everyone knows not to trust me to do that, and I don't know why I put I should have let someone else put the right one in. You already had that link. You're on this webinar.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll correct the slides then when we get that out, and we'll do that.
The slides are right. What I put in the chat, the first link was wrong. So,
okay, got it. All right, the slides are right. Okay, so that's good. All right, well, so listen, everyone, thank you again so much for your time. We appreciate it. We look forward to you being in touch. Feel free, if you have specific questions about some of these things, reach out to us. We're engaged directly. Some of us are engaged directly with some of the development of these things with the EU team. So happy to share what we can. All right.
Happy holidays and stay well, everyone.